Noah is a Vice Chancellor Scholar based at the Centre for Medieval and Early Modern Studies at the University of Kent. His thesis, Images of Conflict, the Formation of Cultural Memory and Civic Identity in the Wake of the Franco-Flemish War, 1297 to 1305, analyses cultural artefacts created during and immediately after the conflict. I'm really looking forward to the presentation today because I think Noah's going to take us through some of his findings and look in detail at some particular objects and material culture, which I think is going to be a real treat. So I can see you're all set, Noah, and I will hand over to you now. Thank you.
I'd just like to begin by thanking the IHR for their support and for organizing this excellent series, of which I'm very honored to be a part. I'd also like to extend a very heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taking your time out of the middle of your week all over the world to be here. That's just really gratifying, edifying. I'm just blown away. I am currently in the final year of my PhD at the University of Kent, and my work revolves around concepts of identity and memory in the 14th century, in 14th century Flanders, where I pay particular attention to the articulated experiences of the guilds, specifically in Bruges and in Ghent. This includes an analysis of their material legacy, as well as the spaces and rituals they used to establish themselves in the hierarchical, symbolic, and intensely pluralistic world of the medieval city. In the spirit of the breadth and the width of knowledge sitting on the other side of my computer screen, I've tried to make this paper as kind of broad and approachable as possible. And to that end, my intention today is to present two core case studies from my thesis and contextualize them in a wider methodological framework. So, before I introduce my case studies, some historical context is warranted. Not everyone here is a medievalist, and I apologize in advance to the medievalists for the amount of topical hand-waving I'm about to do. So the political situation at the turn of the 14th century was quite fraught for Flanders. The Count Guy of Dampierre was imprisoned along with his eldest son and several other notable family members by Philip IV in retaliation for denouncing his liege and making political overtures to Edward I. Edward I, for his part, had wintered an army in Ghent in 1297, though at no point did he move to intercede directly on Guy's behalf. Quite the opposite, his men engaged in running street battles with the townspeople of Ghent, resulting in what the Annals Gandensis, a chronicle penned by an anonymous Franciscan circa 1308, laments as the shedding of much blood. By 1302, Philip IV had installed a number of French administrators throughout the county and constructed new fortifications in several of the larger or more geographically relevant towns and cities, such as Bruges, Courtrai, and Lille. The Flemish population, for their part, were effectively split into two camps, the anti-French Clouards and the pro-French Liliards. The patrician elements of the cities, as well as much of the mercantile class, were generally pro-French, while the rural communities and always politically volatile craft guilds, most infamously the weavers, who were ready to revolt at the drop of a hat, were staunchly against the perceived foreign influence. This in turn led to even more popular unrest in Flanders, which saw notable leaders such as Pieter de Conick actively resisting French rule, and even going so far as to convince the commonalty of Bruges to tear down their new fortifications. Finally, events came to a head in May 1302 when a party of French administrators, along with their entourage and garrison, were attacked in a nocturnal massacre known as the Bruges Matins. Those sources differ, and French sources in particular differ quite significantly. They feel very strongly about this. The Annals Gandensis makes it quite clear that the fighting was the result of a miscommunication between the town and Jacques de Châtillon, the French administrator. In response to the widespread Flemish uprising, Count Robert I of Artois led a punitive campaign into Flanders, and he was met at Courtrai by a combined force of Flemish militias from Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, as well as many other smaller communities and rural assemblies. The Flemish force, for their part, was predominantly led by Guy of Namur and William of Ulick, the first being a younger son of the imprisoned Guy and the latter a grandson. The resulting Battle of the Golden Spurs on 11 July 1302, or Golden Spurenslag in Dutch, is one of the most famous battles of the late medieval period and was certainly regarded at the time as an infamous or miraculous event. The Flemish guilds roundly defeated the French army, which at the time was regarded as the pinnacle of chivalry and martial prowess. The event was immediately mythologized, both in prose, such as Ludwig van Veltem's continuation of the Spiegel Historial, and in poetry, such as the Passio Francorum Secundum Flamingo, a highly satirical poem that uses biblical pericopes to ribald the French ad nauseum. This manuscript illumination from a copy of the 15th century French Chronique de Flandre encapsulates many of the mythological elements that had been codified nearly a century after the fact. the presence of nefarious ditches used to trick the French knights, the Flemish guilds and militia having to do little more than finish off their helpless foe, and a framework that paints the French as noble victims of an ignoble foe and inadequate leadership. And just as a brief aside, I include this slide to demonstrate that the process of mythologizing the battle is still very much ongoing, whether in nationalist illustration, comic books, or historical reenactment. The cartoon in the middle reads, "Come, let us go fight to the death today so that 700 years from now someone can make a tactless speech." I just think it's important to be cognizant of the degree to which this history is kind of still relevant in both a popular and a political context. Enter the Courtrai Chest. Discovered by Warden Archibald Spooner in Stanton St. John during a routine progress through the tenancies of New College, Oxford, the chest was being used as a makeshift corn bin. The chest has a history that is long, controversial, and fraught with national and institutional debate and schism. It has been dismissed as a fake, evaluated by Sotheby's for £1 million, displayed in Belgium, reconstructed in facsimile, and thankfully subjected to a battery of material and dendrochronological analysis over the course of the last 100 years. Dating of the frontispiece, and I must stress that any reference to the Courtrai Chest is fundamentally concerned with its frontispiece, places it as being constructed from oak planks felled prior to the events which it depicts, the Battle of the Golden Spurs, and its iconographical and historical visual program, carved in low relief across its frontispiece, are corroborated by contemporary examples such as the aforementioned Annales Gandensis and the Leugemeete Chapel, which we will get to. I took this particular picture while it was still on loan to the Ashmolean, but it's now safely back in the Muniments Tower in New College. Not that anyone can get there. Before I continue, I should probably say something about its provenance. I could present an entirely separate paper on all the theories that have been floated over the years, how the chest could have been broken up and smuggled into the country during the 30 Years' War, or that it was the personal property of William Shakespeare. I kid you not. One theory that does warrant addressing, however, is that the chest was constructed as a diplomatic gift to Sir John of Stanton St. John, who allegedly had the ear of Edward I. This theory is predicated upon a supposed secret compartment, a false bottom accessed with a crowbar directly through the decorated front, and its place of rediscovery by Spooner. While documentary evidence does not necessarily corroborate this, of the two often conflated Johns of Stanton St. John, neither were active around Stanton until well after the Flemish Rebellion had been put down circa 1305, nor are there any records of a Flemish diplomatic mission to England at the time, nor are there any material precedents for such a mechanically elaborate hidden switch at the turn of the 14th century. It is important to consider just how the frontispiece found its way to England and who may have brought it with them. And just very quickly, I think it's important to say that there is, however, a precedent of 14th and 15th century Flemish chests, or chests of Flemish make, turning up in England. Pictured are examples found in Ainswick and Hardy, respectively. Similarly, recent and exceedingly good scholarship has turned a spotlight onto just how porous the channel was in the late medieval period, with a considerably high rate of immigration from Flanders, specifically of skilled labor. You need look no further than the Edicts of Edward III to find an English desire for skilled Flemish weavers and fullers, for example. This context is important to keep in mind when discussing its visual program. I think it's very important to remember that this was carved by a specific person for a specific reason to commemorate a specific event. And so, starting in the upper left corner of the frontispiece, the narrative begins with the arrival of Guy of Namur and William of Ulick, as denoted by their heraldry, a lion rampant with bar for Guy and a flowered lion for William. They are accompanied by an entourage of similarly mounted knights, though specific emphasis has been placed on the two central noblemen as they wear open-faced helmets similar to those of the infantrymen and are led by a Hodendag wielding soldier. The infamous Flemish weapon, the Hodendag, basically a giant mean club with a metal metered spike on the end, was Yes, the famous Flemish weapon was itself a subject of fierce debate in the 19th and 20th centuries, as many prominent historians had incorrectly envisaged it as a flail-like weapon. This in turn led to several of the early and more dismissive assessments of the frontispiece authenticity, especially in Belgium. Past the lock, and a trio of huddled aldermen offering a key towards the approaching Guy and William, and they are also looking directly to the lock, which itself is a wonderful little visual pun. One of the most famous scenes of the chess iconography can be seen unfolding. J.F. Verbruggen, the late venerable Belgian historian, who quite notably published the first and arguably most internally consistent analysis of the chest's visual program as part of a much larger and more masterful monograph on the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1952, contributed to the codification of the scene as a representation of the infamous Bruges Matins. If you Google Bruges Matins, this is like the third picture that comes up. One of the prime original outputs of my work, however, has been a re-identification of this scene as not a vignette of a French knight being set upon in his sleepwear while a female saint in a dress looks on, but rather as a site-specific indictment of the punitive French harassment of Flemish communities in general and their actions in Courtrai specifically. To quote the Annales Gandensis, as the French entered Flemish-speaking Flanders to show their ferocity and terrorize the Flemings, they spared neither women nor children nor the sick, but slew all they could find. They even beheaded the images of saints in the churches as though they were alive, or chopped off their limbs. However, such doings did not terrorize the Flemings, but stimulated and provoked them to still greater indignation and rage and violent fighting. I submit that the visual juxtaposition of the gruesome beheading of the prayerful robed man, garbed identically to those aldermen gathered on the other side of the still open gate, with the hand reaching towards the saint, is the designer of the chest signaling the iconoclastic blasphemy of the French alongside the physical violence directed at the Flemings themselves. The macabre smiling of the man beheading the robed alderman, staring in the direction of the other citizens who have just fled the town, is met immediately by a stern-faced soldier bearing a shield and upraised sword. Furthermore, the structure housing the saint bears the hallmark of iconographic signifiers of a church, with its steepled roof and a reliquary or shrine beneath the carved figure. The attributes of the saint, a pallium and mitre, suggest the presence of a cult of St. Martin, and St. Martin's Kirk was one of the two prominent churches in Courtrai at the time. Finally, we know that Guy and William were never around Bruges at the same time, and it was around Courtrai that the disparate Flemish forces coalesced before engaging the French. So in the interest of time, I will briefly go through the rest of the chest's iconography, starting with the leftmost section of the middle tier of carving. A robed monk can be seen blessing a bowed soldier, while the line of Flemish militia gather before battle. They hold flags that bear the emblems of numerous craft guilds, fullers, shipwrights, wine loaders, and many prominently display the Hodendog. The Hodendog is very much operating as a signifier of the guild militia across the entire frontispiece. On the right side, the motif of impious violence is reiterated, with a trio of soldiers murdering a kneeling, prayerful figure on the far side of an ongoing combat between Hodendog-wielding soldiers and a mounted knight. And I should stress that this section of the chest is probably one of the most ambiguous sections. Almost everyone who's written on it either agrees that we can come to no conclusion or offer their own different conclusions. So this is very speculative here. And a mounted knight. Of note is the repeated left-handedness of the soldier killing the kneeling man, as well as that of the crossbowman. The crossbow itself serves to break the space between the two groups, while the dead militiaman, run through by a lance shaft, reinforces the stakes of the combat. On the lower left side of the chest, this is my personal favorite part of the chest, the space is dominated by the structure of the Courtrai Castle, showing the moment during the battle when the Ypres militia repelled a sally by the French garrison. A figure can be seen being raised on the left side of the castle. If we look to the Spiegel Historiale and the Annales Gandensis, they both mention a community of secular women of Beguines, and I think that this could be another visual pun, something along the lines of the French setting fire to the town and abducting Beguines, but that is very much kind of TBD. Finally, the lower right section of the chest depicts the Flemish militia in combat during the battle. This section has proved the most useful for military historians, as the famous Flemish formation is displayed in considerable detail. A pikeman repels a charging knight. Guy and William lead from the front behind a splayed wall of pikes and alongside a row of crossbowmen. Underneath, the grisly aftermath of the battle portrays scenes of looting, corresponding to contemporary accounts that looting and prisoner-taking were strictly prohibited during the fighting. So, the designer of the Courtrai Chest, as I hope to have demonstrated, is chiefly concerned with three things: identity, chronology, and morality. The personages of individuals and groups, the heraldry of Guy of Namur, the gathered banners of the guilds, and their respective actions are given specific attention across the breadth of the frontispiece. The sequencing of events, like any good paratactic medieval narrative, lends itself to a story that is essentially supportive of the Flemish casus belli going into the Battle of the Golden Spurs. Guy and William arrive to aid a beleaguered populace, which in turn gives them the right and obligation to engage in a divinely sanctioned combat against the French. Finally, the impiousness and sacrilege committed by the French, both against the Flemish people and their churches and shrines, further reinforces the just and righteous intervention of Guy, William, and the militia in particular, while setting a precedent for the Flemish rebellion against Philip in general. So I will take a sip of water. Keeping in mind this idea of a visual program serving to instill a sense of meaning and justification to a series of events and their respective participants, let us flash forward 30 years to the middle of the 14th century and the Chapel of St. John and St. Paul in Ghent. Founded in 1316 as a charity for women and eventually patronized by the guild circa 1334, the building, nicknamed Leugemeete, or Lyre in the early modern period due to a broken clock on its facade, experienced a period of dramatic rebirth in the early 19th century when a stunningly complex series of monumental wall paintings were discovered under whitewash by this man, Felix de Veen. Felix, a local antiquarian, committed them to watercolor and published them the following year in 1847. In 1860, Baron Jean-Baptiste Béthune, one of the leading art historians in Belgium at the time, led a team in creating a series of wax tracings, or calques, as well as an architectural survey. The chapel itself is no longer extant, having been demolished in 1911 during an expansion of the city's industrial zone. I particularly enjoy right here, De Veen really he worked on the faces as hard, like he really wanted to get the faces right. The one on the right, I think, is particularly charming. However, and these are Béthune's calques, which are currently stored at the Stam Museum, and if you ask very nicely, they will let you see them, but you cannot touch. However, Béthune's calques, alongside De Veen's watercolors, give us an excellent idea of what the visual program of the Leugemeete entailed. This included monumental patron portraits of St. John and St. Paul, as well as a donor portrait of Louis I of Nevers and his son and wife directly below a tree of Jesse. For my research, however, the most remarkable feature of the chapel was the upper tier of decoration that depicted groups of guilds marching in the direction of the altar. Those groups present include the Brotherhood of St. George, the Brotherhood of St. Sebastian, the town's shooting confraternity, the Butchers' Guild, the Fishmongers' Guild, the Bakers' Guild, and what is most likely the Brewers' Guild. The only extant piece of guild iconography from the north wall, which is the one that's falling just a little bit out of line, is the Textile Cutters' Guild. So, similarly to how the guild iconography present on the frontispiece of the Courtrai Chest serves to establish a connection between those groups, the depicted political personages, and overarching narrative could potentially hint at what the chest's original function was, the presence of the guild iconography in the Leugemeete Chapel serves as a function of the space in which it was painted. Using the architectural notes of Béthune's team, notably Auguste Van Asch, alongside earlier 17th and 18th century records and plans, I've done a small amount of digital reconstruction in an attempt to better understand the implicit function of the chapel in an urban context. One of the things that become immediately apparent is that the physical layout of the chapel lends itself to procession. Hundreds of people could have been funneled into the building from the main street, processed towards the altar alongside and in the direction of those guilds depicted on the walls, and then moved out of the second door to the right of the altar. The chapel was a forward-facing space that the guilds could use to project their own identity, resplendent, organized, yet professionally diverse defenders of the public good, while creating symbolic, theological, and political connections. The placement of the, and I should mention on the 3D stuff, the red spaces are where we have extant wall paintings. The placement of the donor portrait of Louis, situated to the right of the altar and adjacent to the door, at head height and beneath the towering tree of Jesse, echoes the concerns of the Courtrai Chest, establishing strong connections and connotations between the guilds and specific political figures. Circa 1340, Ghent had undergone considerable domestic troubles, not least of which being the famous Peasants' Revolt of 1323-28, during which the Ghent militia put down an attempted uprising instigated within the city by the always problematic weavers. The triumphant parading of the guilds in the upper register in the direction of the altar, the chapel's patron saints, and the count reinforces that social hierarchy of the space while placing the guild militia as its implicit defenders. To contextualize the Leugemeete in the broader urban space of Ghent, I find the 16th century panorama particularly useful in understanding how the very location of the building lent itself to these concepts of ritual procession and remembrance. Any group wishing to process around or through the city would naturally find themselves in the vicinity of the Bruges Gate, and the Leugemeete's procession on the liminal edge of the city aligns itself with the defensive and protectionist nature of the guild militia. They're literally between the liminal space of where the city ends and where the city begins. I hope to have demonstrated today that both the Courtrai Chest and the Leugemeete Chapel are engines of memory and purpose. They serve very specific and, most importantly, utilitarian functions, and they use a series of visually similar guild iconography in their artistic programs to accomplish these ends. While I am still working on articulating and expanding the concept of guild space in my thesis, I hope to leave you with this by way of a conclusion. The ravages of time and circumstance have left us little extant middling objects from late medieval Flanders. These guilds and confraternities wanted to see themselves and their actions reflected in the spaces around them, and both the Courtrai Chest and the Leugemeete Chapel hint at a much wider world of symbolic meaning and communal projection. Just thank you so much. Thank you very much for listening.